In 1905, in Chicago, a photographer named Arthur Vell received what seemed like a very simple job: to retouch a photograph taken at the opening ceremony of a train station. At that time, altering photographs was not unusual. Professionals like Arthur often scraped lightly across glass negatives to remove a stain, blur a person who had accidentally entered the frame, or correct a detail that a client did not want preserved. But this time, the person who needed to be erased was not standing in the crowd. She was not standing in front of the station, and she was not standing on a balcony. She was behind the entire structure, beyond the glass roof and the rows of steel columns, in a place almost no one below could have seen. And even though only the upper half of her body was visible, her head still rose above the station's second floor. Arthur placed the negative under a magnifying glass and saw a woman. She had long hair, wore a pale robe-like garment, and rested one hand on the edge of the glass roof as casually as an ordinary person might rest a hand on a railing. The strange part was that she was not blurred, distorted, or shaped like a developing error. She cast a shadow. Her hand blocked part of the steel frame. On the glass nearby, there was even a faint reflection of her shoulder. But what made Arthur go cold was not her size. It was her eyes. In the photograph, hundreds of people were looking toward the opening ceremony. The officials were looking into the lens. The workers were looking down at the crowd, and passers-by were looking toward the newly opened station. Only that woman was looking directly at the camera, as if she knew the exact moment she was being recorded. Arthur refused to erase her from the photograph. The next morning, his studio was searched. The original glass negative disappeared. His notebook of technical exposure records disappeared as well. But Arthur had already made one test print, and he had hidden it inside the wooden body of his large camera. 37 years later, after Arthur died, his son found that print. On the back of it, Arthur had written only one sentence: "She did not appear in the frame by accident. She was brought there." So who was that woman? Why did she appear behind a train station on the exact day it opened? And why was someone willing to pay a great deal of money simply to erase her from a photograph? Arthur Vell was not the kind of man who was easily drawn into strange stories. He was born in 1871 in Illinois, into a German immigrant family. His father was a mechanic. His mother worked in a sewing shop, and Arthur began learning photography when he was only 16. In the early years, he was an assistant at a small portrait studio, cleaning glass plates, preparing chemicals, carrying camera equipment, and learning how to process negatives. By the early 1900s, Arthur had his own studio in Chicago. But he was not an art photographer, nor was he known for photographing high society. Most of his work was commercial and architectural. Warehouses, steel bridges, new office buildings, factories, and occasionally opening ceremonies for transportation or railway companies. It was not glamorous work, but it demanded accuracy. A photograph of a building had to preserve proportions, light, structure, and depth without misleading the viewer. For that reason, Arthur kept unusually careful records. For every photograph, he wrote down the time of exposure, the direction of the light, the distance between the camera and the subject, the type of lens, the exposure time, and even the weather conditions. People who worked with him described him as quiet, punctual, cautious, and not given to exaggeration. He did not write newspaper articles, did not speak publicly about mysteries, and did not make money from sensational claims. On the afternoon of October 18, 1905, a stranger came to Arthur's studio just as he was preparing to close. The man wore a long black coat and a low hat, and he carried a flat wooden case wrapped in oilcloth. He left no business card, did not identify the client he represented, and did not ask for an invoice. Inside the case was a large glass negative showing the opening ceremony of a new train station in western Chicago. The man said, very briefly, that a figure in the photograph had to be removed. Arthur asked where that figure was standing. The man did not point to anyone in the crowd, nor did he mention any of the officials in front. He pointed instead to the glass roof at the rear of the station and said, "When you enlarge it, you will see." That sentence caught Arthur's attention. An ordinary client would not have phrased it that way. If it was merely a person who had wandered into the frame, they would point to the location. If it was a stain, they would call it a stain. But this man spoke as though he already knew Arthur would find something hidden from the naked eye. Arthur asked for the name of the client. The man said it did not need to be recorded. Arthur asked which railway company the photograph belonged to. The man did not answer. Instead, he placed an envelope of cash on the table. The amount inside was many times higher than a normal retouching fee. The instructions were precise. Remove the figure behind the glass roof completely, keep no copies of any kind, and return both the original negative and all test prints once the work was finished. Before leaving, the man added a sentence Arthur would remember for the rest of his life. "There is no person in the photograph, that is why we hired you." The sentence made no sense. If there was no person, nothing needed to be erased. If it was only a technical flaw, there was no need to pay so much. And if the photograph was unimportant, it would not have arrived in a sealed wooden case like a piece of evidence. Arthur accepted the job, but not because of the money. He accepted it because of professional instinct. The better a photographer is, the harder it becomes to ignore a detail someone else is trying to make him stop looking at. That evening, Arthur carried the glass negative into his darkroom. He placed it beneath the magnifying glass, adjusted the lamp, and began examining the rear glass roof of the station. At first, the image showed only the familiar structure of a new building. Steel frames, bracing beams, decorative flags, and layered reflections across the glass. But when Arthur reduced the direct light and tilted the negative slightly, another shape began to separate itself from the architecture. The first thing he saw was a hand. It rested on the edge of the glass roof, the 5 fingers stretched gently, not gripping or climbing. The hand looked as if its owner was standing behind something lower than herself and resting on it for balance. Arthur dusted the glass, checked for scratches, changed the angle of the light, and looked again. The hand remained. It was not on the surface of the negative like a physical defect. It was inside the space of the photograph. From the hand, Arthur followed the arm to the shoulder, then the neck, and then the face. The figure was a woman, or at least shaped like a woman. She stood behind the structure, near the auxiliary tracks, outside the official ceremony area. Using the height of the steel columns and the glass roof as reference points, Arthur estimated that if she stood upright, she would be over 5 meters tall. What unsettled Arthur was that her body did not look deformed. Cases of medical gigantism usually leave obvious marks: distorted proportions, heavy facial bones, uneven limbs, or difficulty in posture. The woman in the photograph showed none of that. Her shoulders, neck, head, and arms were balanced. She did not look like someone whose body had betrayed her. She looked like an ordinary person who belonged to a different scale. Arthur began checking whether the image could have been composited. A flag near the glass roof was partially blocked by her hand. A shadow fell across the steel frame behind her in the correct direction. A worker on the distant scaffolding was turning his head upward toward the exact place where she stood. On a nearby pane of glass, a faint reflection of her shoulder could be seen. These details made the possibility of a simple technical error almost impossible to defend. A fabricated image might produce the outline of a person. But faking a shadow, an object being blocked, a glass reflection, and the reaction of someone else in the frame, all on the same glass negative, would have been almost impossible with ordinary retouching methods at the time. Arthur wrote in his work notebook, "Figure is not an optical flaw, position is real. Scale cannot be explained by perspective." Then he noticed another detail lower in the image. In the darkness beneath the rear canopy stood a rail car on the auxiliary track. It was taller than the freight cars around it. Its door was thick and windowless. On its side, visible only at strong magnification, was a small symbol, an eye inside a doorway. Arthur had never seen that mark in any railway emblem or industrial seal. But a few days later he would see it again, not in another photograph, but on a steel door deep beneath the station itself. The next morning, the man in the black coat returned. Arthur placed the negative on the table, pushed the envelope of money back toward him, and said he could not continue unless he knew who the person in the photograph was. For a man of Arthur's temperament, that was an unusual reaction. He was not confrontational with clients, but this time he knew he was not being asked to remove an unwanted detail. He was being asked to erase evidence. The man did not appear surprised. He only looked down at the negative and said that Arthur had been hired to retouch a photograph, not to ask questions. Arthur answered that this was not a stain and not a lighting error. This was a person. After a moment of silence, the man corrected him in an eerily calm voice. "No, It is an irregularity in the public record. That choice of words made Arthur go cold. The man did not call her a woman, a stranger, or an intruder. He called her an irregularity, as if the problem was not that an impossibly large living being was being held or transported, but that she had appeared inside an official image. Before leaving the studio, the man left Arthur with one more sentence. "Mr. Vell, a photograph can distort history, but a man who keeps that photograph does not live long enough to correct history." Arthur did not know whether it was a threat or a warning. It may have been both. But after the man left, Arthur did something that directly violated the instructions he had been given. He made one small test print from the original negative and hid it inside a wooden cavity in his large camera, a place only someone who had taken the machine apart would know about. That night, Arthur's studio was searched. No door was broken, no money was taken, no camera disappeared. Whoever entered took only the original glass negative, the notebook of technical records, and several sheets Arthur had used to mark the woman's position in the frame. They knew exactly what to look for, and they knew exactly what did not matter. From that moment, Arthur understood that the matter had moved beyond an odd retouching assignment. Some group knew where the negative was, knew Arthur had examined it, knew he kept records, and had enough access to enter his studio without leaving signs of forced entry. They had not come to steal. They had come to recover. But they did not know about the test print, and that was the first surviving piece of evidence. In the days that followed, Arthur tried to convince himself that silence was the safest choice. He had a wife, a small child, a studio to support, and no protection of any kind against people who could search his workplace without breaking a door. But a photographer does not forget images the way other people do. Arthur remembered the scale of the hand on the glass roof, the shadow on the steel frame, the unusually tall rail car in the darkness, and above all, the woman's eyes. He began looking into the station shown in the photograph. Its name appeared on the opening banner, West Meridian Terminal. Newspaper notices described it as a new freight terminal in western Chicago, built to relieve pressure on the city's overloaded central lines. Every public description was ordinary: a modern structure, a broad glass roof, auxiliary tracks for freight, new storage buildings, and the ability to receive several trains at once. But when Arthur went there himself, he noticed that the rear of the station had already been fenced off, even though the building had opened less than a month earlier. The area where the woman appeared in the photograph was hidden behind a tall wooden barrier and guarded. A sign read, "Technical Area. Authorized personnel only." But the level of security was far stricter than anything Arthur had ever seen around an ordinary technical section. Arthur circled around to the freight side. From there, he saw the auxiliary track from the photograph. It did not lead into the public loading area. Instead, it descended along a shallow slope and disappeared behind a steel arched door set into the lower rear of the terminal. The door was much taller than any warehouse or freight door Arthur had ever photographed. On its surface was a small symbol, the eye inside a doorway. A gate guard approached and asked what Arthur needed. Arthur said he was a photographer hired to take additional pictures of the building. The guard looked at the camera in his hand and said no one was allowed to photograph the rear of the station. When Arthur asked why, the guard answered, "Because the rear of the station does not belong to the station." The sentence sounded meaningless, but the way the man said it suggested that it had not been invented on the spot. It sounded rehearsed, like an answer prepared for anyone who asked too many questions. As Arthur turned to leave, a young woman in a ticket clerk's uniform glanced at him from near a side entrance. She bent down as if picking up a scrap of paper, and as she passed Arthur, she slipped it into his hand. 4 words had been written on it in a hurried hand: "Do not ask by day." That night, Arthur returned to the area near the station. He did not bring his large camera, only a small notebook. At exactly 9 o'clock, the ticket clerk appeared in the southern alley. Her name was Eleanor Price. She was 19 years old and had worked at West Meridian Terminal for 3 months. Eleanor did not know who Arthur was, but she had seen the way he looked at the steel door behind the station. She said she had seen that look before, the look of someone who had seen something he was not supposed to see. Eleanor explained that West Meridian Terminal had 2 train schedules. The first was public and hung in the main hall where anyone could read it. The second was never entered into the common ledger. It arrived every Thursday in a sealed envelope addressed to the station master. The trains on the second schedule had no passengers, no ordinary numbers, and no listed destinations. They usually came after midnight, stopped at the rear section, and left before dawn. On nights when those special trains arrived, ticket clerks were not allowed near the rear area. Loading workers were rotated out. The ordinary gate guards were replaced by men in gray uniforms. Eleanor said those men did not behave like railway employees. They did not use names, did not speak to station staff, and did not appear to answer to the station master. Once, Eleanor saw one of the special rail cars from a distance. It was taller than a normal freight car, had no windows, and its door was reinforced with steel. Large chains hung along both sides. They did not look as though they were meant to secure cargo on the outside. They looked as though they were meant to hold something inside. When Arthur asked whether she had ever seen the woman in the photograph, Eleanor was silent for a long time. Finally, she said she had never seen the whole figure, but she had seen a hand. One night, while she was counting money at the end of her shift, she heard metal striking metal behind the station. Through a crack in the door, she saw an enormous hand resting on the roof of a rail car. There was a metal band around the wrist, and from inside the car came a low sound like a voice trying to speak through several layers of wall. Then Eleanor heard a man shout, "Do not let her turn her face toward the light." Immediately afterward, the entire rear section went dark. Arthur asked why she was helping him. Eleanor answered that on the night of the opening ceremony, she too had seen the woman from far away. But what stayed with her was not the woman's height. It was that she did not look at the men escorting her, and she did not look at the crowd. She looked toward the camera. "I think she wanted someone to see her," Eleanor said. That sentence confirmed what Arthur had felt when he first examined the image. The woman had not accidentally fallen into the frame. She had placed herself in the single gap between the glass roof, the decorative flags, and the steel frame. A position invisible to most people below, but visible to a camera set far enough away. She had chosen the lens. After meeting Eleanor, Arthur went home and took the hidden test print out of the camera. This time, he did not look at it as a photograph. He looked at it as a document that needed to be decoded. He divided the frame into small areas, used a stronger magnifying glass, and recorded every detail he could find. At the woman's neck, Arthur noticed a small metal object. At first, he thought it might be jewelry or a clasp, but at greater magnification, it looked more like an inventory tag. Several markings on it were blurred, but 3 characters remained clear enough to read: F7. That detail changed the direction of the entire story. If it was a personal mark, it might have been initials. But if it was a classification code, then the woman had not appeared by chance. She belonged to a system that recorded, numbered, and controlled its subjects. A person is only numbered when someone has decided that person can be treated as an object of management. Arthur continued examining the print. In the darkness behind the woman, he saw at least 4 men in gray uniforms standing at different elevated positions. They were not panicking. They were not running. They were not looking at her as though she had suddenly appeared. Their posture resembled that of an escort team. Beneath the special rail car, Arthur also noticed a long mark across the floor. It looked like the trace of something heavy being dragged, but its direction did not run from outside into the rail car. It ran from the rail car outward. That made Arthur think the woman had been taken down from the car before the opening ceremony, while hundreds of people were standing in front of the station, listening to speeches and posing for photographs. Eleanor later showed Arthur the small notebook in which she had secretly recorded the train movements for almost 2 months. Several codes appeared repeatedly: F3, F5, F7, C2, M1. Besides some of the entries, she had written short notes: voices in the car, chains dragged across the floor, no lights allowed, and the woman was crying. At that point, Arthur understood that he was no longer holding evidence of a single giant woman. He was touching the edge of a transport network. The station was not merely a station. It was a transfer point, and F7 may have been only one code among many. Eleanor agreed to help Arthur enter the rear section of the station during the shift change between the day guards and the men in gray uniforms. The window was very short, only a few minutes, but it was enough for them to pass through a side door behind the baggage room and descend the service stairs. At first, Arthur expected to find an ordinary station basement, coal storage, pipes, electrical wiring, and mechanical rooms. But they passed the first lower level and continued down to a second one. The walls there did not match the newer construction above. They were not industrial brick and not ordinary concrete. They were made of pale gray-white stone, smooth and cold, with blocks fitted so tightly that the joints were almost invisible. Arthur had photographed many large structures, but he had never seen this kind of masonry in a newly completed railway terminal. At the end of the corridor stood the steel door he had seen from outside. Up close, it was far larger than he had imagined, around 6 meters high, with hinges the size of bridge lift components and a surface that felt thick and cold. On the door was the eye inside the doorway. Beneath it was a small metal plate that read, "Transit Chamber, F level." Eleanor asked what F level meant. Arthur did not answer, because he was thinking of the F7 tag at the woman's neck. If F was a level, a route, or a classification group, then she was not the only subject. She belonged to a list. As Arthur moved closer to the door, he heard a sound from the other side. It was not machinery. It was not a train. It sounded like very slow, very deep breathing, carrying through the steel, as though wind had been trapped inside a room too large to understand. Eleanor wanted to leave, but Arthur noticed a pale piece of fabric caught in the lower seam of the door. He pulled it free. The material was thick, soft, and unusually strong, unlike cotton or silk. On it was a dark stain that had not fully dried. Blood. Then 3 knocks came from behind the door. Slow, clear, evenly spaced. They did not sound like an animal scratching or like random impact. They sounded like a signal. Arthur and Eleanor stood frozen. 3 more knocks followed. Then came a very low voice in an unfamiliar language, but with an unmistakable rhythm. The sound was not violent. It sounded like someone trying to speak softly so the people outside would not be afraid. Eleanor whispered, "It is her." Arthur did not understand the words behind the door, but he understood the pattern. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 knocks again. That was how a trapped person might try to prove consciousness, that she was not cargo, not an animal, not a line of code in a transport ledger. Arthur raised his hand and knocked 3 times in return. The other side went silent at once. A moment later, there was a small sound of metal sliding across stone. From a narrow slot in the door, a curved piece of metal was pushed out. Arthur picked it up and saw an engraving of a station. Beneath the station, 7 tunnels spread outward. At the end of each tunnel was a symbol shaped like a standing human figure, but impossibly tall. He had only enough time to hide the metal inside his coat before footsteps sounded from above. The men in gray were coming down. Eleanor pulled him back up the service stairs, and they escaped through the coal room door just before dawn. Arthur did not go home immediately. He sat in the alley behind the station and watched the silent tracks. A little after 4 in the morning, the rear steel door opened. A special rail car rolled out slowly. There were no passengers, no lights inside, and no visible operator. High near the roof of the car, behind a frosted panel, Arthur saw a very large hand press against the glass from within. It did not strike. It did not scratch. It did not resist. It simply remained there like a farewell. The next morning, Eleanor did not report for work. The ticket office manager claimed she had resigned, but Arthur knew that was not true. Eleanor had no family in Chicago, no savings, and no reason to vanish immediately after the night they entered the lower level. When Arthur visited her boarding room, it was empty. No suitcase, no clothes, no letters. Everything had been cleared too cleanly, as if the room had been emptied by someone trying to erase a trace, not by a young woman leaving in a hurry. Only the notebook of secret train movements remained, hidden beneath the mattress. On the last page, Eleanor had written, "If I disappear, do not look for me in the city. They do not keep people who know things in places that can be found on a map." Arthur hid that notebook with the test print, the cloth, and the curved piece of metal. After that night, he never returned to West Meridian Terminal. He also refused every commission involving train stations, railway warehouses, or transport buildings. In 1922, West Meridian Terminal was closed after a fire in the rear freight section. Newspapers called it an electrical accident, and no official deaths were reported. The railway company announced that the station was outdated, that repairs would be too expensive, and that it would be demolished to make room for a new transfer warehouse. But in a private letter written by a demolition worker named Patrick Hales to his brother, the fire was described very differently. Patrick wrote that the flames did not appear to begin in the freight room. They seemed to have risen from below. When the workers broke through the western floor, they found an underground level that did not appear on the demolition drawings, with pale gray-white stone walls and a steel door about 6 meters high. The door was bent outward, as though it had been pushed from the inside. Near that door, Patrick found a piece of metal. One side bore the symbol of the eye inside a doorway. The other side had 3 characters, F7. Years later, Patrick's grandson showed the metal piece to a local railway researcher who photographed it and sent an inquiry to a transportation museum. No answer came back. 2 months later, the metal piece disappeared from the grandson's home. No door had been forced. No valuables were taken. Only that piece of metal was gone. Once again, the physical evidence had been recovered, but the photograph of it remained. Arthur Vell died in 1942. He never published the photograph, never sold the story to the press, and never tried to make himself famous as a witness. What he left behind was a sealed envelope containing the test print, the fabric from beneath the steel door, his written account, and one final line. For years, I thought she wanted to be rescued. But after looking at the photograph for so long, I no longer believe that. She knew none of us had the power to save her. What she wanted was not freedom. What she wanted was for someone to remember that she had been here. That is what makes the photograph frightening. Not only because it appears to show a giant woman standing behind a Chicago train station in 1905, but because it suggests that she understood a cruel truth. If no one sees you, if no one records you, and if every document about you can be altered, then history can behave as though you never existed. Arthur did not save F7, but he kept the evidence that she had once been there. And to this day, the final questions remain unanswered. Who brought her to Chicago? Where was she taken after the opening night? Was F7 a name, a classification,